Did you know that ancient scriptures contain prophecies about which nations will fall first in the end times? These aren't human guesses. They're divine predictions written thousands of years ago that describe exactly how world powers will face God's judgment. The Bible contains a hidden code that reveals the precise order in which nations will experience divine wrath, and understanding these prophecies is crucial for comprehending the times we live in today. Long ago, the prophet Daniel lived in Babylon as a prisoner during the Jewish exile. This was a dark period in Israel's history when God's chosen people had been taken captive because of their own rebellion and disobedience. During this time of captivity, King Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream that kept him awake at night and troubled his spirit deeply. The dream was so vivid and frightening that it haunted the king's thoughts and made him desperate to understand its meaning. This wasn't just any ordinary dream that people might have during restless sleep. It was God himself revealing to this pagan king the future destiny of all nations from that time until the very end of the world. The Almighty chose to use this Babylonian ruler as the vessel for one of the most important prophecies in all of human history. In the remarkable dream, the king saw a massive statue that towered above everything around it like a giant monument to human power and achievement. The head was made of pure gold that gleamed brilliantly in the light, representing the glory and wealth of Babylon itself. The chest and arms were formed of solid silver, symbolizing the Medo-Persian Empire that would follow. The belly and thighs were crafted from bronze, pointing to the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. The legs were made of strong iron, representing the Roman Empire with its military might and brutal efficiency. Most significantly, the feet were a strange mixture of iron and clay that appeared unstable and weak despite the iron's strength. Each precious metal represented a different world power that would rise and dominate the earth, and the descending order of value showed exactly how they would be destroyed in sequence throughout history. Then suddenly, without any human hand touching it, or any earthly force causing it, a supernatural stone appeared and struck the statue's feet with tremendous force, completely crushing the entire massive structure from top to bottom. The stone then began to grow larger and larger, until it became a huge mountain that filled the whole earth, covering every continent and reaching into every nation. This supernatural stone represents God's eternal kingdom that will ultimately triumph and establish perfect rule when all human nations have failed, fallen, and been swept away like dust in the wind. Here's what makes this ancient prophecy critically important for people living today. This vision doesn't just speak about past civilizations that have already come and gone. It points directly toward our modern time and the nations that exist right now. The feet of iron mixed with clay represent today's nations and political systems. They appear strong and powerful like iron when you look at their military might and economic influence, but they're actually weak, internally divided, and unable to maintain true unity despite their attempts at international cooperation through alliances, trade agreements, and global organizations. When God's supernatural stone strikes these unstable foundations, it will bring a complete and final end to all human governments as we know them today. Babylon was the first great world power in recorded history to receive God's direct and immediate judgment, and what happened to this mighty empire serves as both a warning and a prophetic pattern for what will occur again in the last days of human history. The fall of ancient Babylon wasn't just another historical event among many others. It was a prophetic preview and template that shows exactly how God deals with nations that rebel against his authority and oppress his people. During the reign of King Belshazzar, who was the successor to the great King Nebuchadnezzar, something occurred that changed the course of world history forever in a single night. Belshazzar decided to throw an extravagant party in his royal palace, inviting 1,000 of his most important nobles, officials, and military leaders to join him in a celebration of Babylon's power and wealth. In their growing arrogance and drunken pride, these leaders made a fatal mistake that would seal their nation's doom. They commanded their servants to bring out the sacred golden cups, bowls, and vessels that had been stolen from Jerusalem's holy temple when Babylon conquered Israel and destroyed the city. As they drank wine from these consecrated objects that had been dedicated to the worship of the true God, they openly mocked the God of Israel and loudly praised their own false gods, made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. But at the very height of their blasphemous celebration, when their pride and rebellion against the Almighty reached its absolute peak, something supernatural and terrifying happened that struck fear into every heart present in that great hall. A mysterious hand appeared out of nowhere, with no body attached to it, and began writing strange words on the palace wall, while everyone watched in stunned silence. The king's face immediately turned pale with terror. His knees knocked together uncontrollably, and his entire body began to tremble violently as he watched the divine finger slowly inscribe a message of judgment on the wall. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly from celebration to panic, as everyone realized they were witnessing something that was clearly beyond human explanation. The words that appeared were mysterious and terrifying. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. None of the king's wise men, astrologers, magicians, or counselors could understand what these Aramaic words meant, which only increased the fear and dread that gripped everyone in the palace. The tension became unbearable as hours passed without anyone being able to provide an explanation. Finally, at the Queen Mother's suggestion, Daniel the Hebrew prophet was summoned to interpret the divine message. Daniel had served faithfully under previous kings and was known for his wisdom and ability to understand visions and dreams through God's Spirit. When Daniel saw the writing, he immediately understood its meaning, and his explanation was absolutely devastating for the king and his kingdom. Daniel explained that the first word, many, meant that God had carefully counted and numbered every single day of Babylon's existence as a kingdom, and had decided to bring it to a complete and final end. The repetition of the word emphasized the certainty and finality of this divine decision. The second word, Tekel, revealed that King Belshazzar himself had been placed on God's perfect scales of justice and had been weighed according to divine standards, but found to be completely lacking in righteousness, wisdom, moral character, and spiritual understanding. The third word, Upharsin, declared that the once mighty Babylonian Empire would be divided up like pieces of property and given to the Medes and Persians as God's chosen instruments of judgment against the rebellious nation. That very same night, before the sun could rise again on the empire, King Belshazzar was killed by enemy forces, and the seemingly invincible city of Babylon fell to the Medo-Persian army without even putting up significant resistance. The empire that had dominated the known world and seemed destined to last forever crumbled in just a few hours, exactly as God's prophet had foretold. But here's what makes this ancient story critically important for understanding our modern world and current events. Babylon represents far more than just one historical nation that existed long ago and then disappeared. In biblical prophecy, Babylon symbolizes the eternal spirit of human rebellion against God that appears in every generation. This spirit is characterized by pride elevated to its most extreme levels, moral corruption that becomes institutionalized and celebrated by society, and the systematic persecution of God's people who refuse to compromise their faith. According to the book of Revelation, a spiritual Babylon will arise again in the last days of human history before Christ's return. This end-times Babylon will be the very first nation or system to experience God's final judgment, because it will repeat exactly the same sins that brought destruction upon the original Babylon: overwhelming national pride that rejects God's authority, widespread idol worship that puts created things above the Creator, complete moral corruption that calls evil good and good evil, and violent persecution of those who follow the true God and refuse to bow to false systems. Daniel's remarkable prophecy reveals profound and disturbing truths about the iron nations that are represented by the statue's powerful legs. These nations would develop very specific characteristics that would ultimately make them vulnerable to God's judgment, despite their apparent strength and dominance. The iron in the vision symbolizes brutal military power and authoritarian governments that rule their people primarily through force, intimidation, and fear rather than through justice, righteousness, and genuine care for their citizens' welfare. These are nations that place their ultimate trust in their weapons of war, their advanced military technology, their intelligence agencies, and their ability to project power around the world through military bases, economic pressure, and political influence. They believe that might makes right, and that superior firepower can solve any problem or overcome any obstacle that stands in their way. In Daniel's later prophetic visions, these same iron-like nations appear as ferocious wild beasts that devour, tear apart, and destroy everything in their path without mercy, compassion, or restraint. The fourth beast, which Daniel described as being particularly dreadful, terrible, and different from all the others, represents nations that will successfully combine overwhelming military might with systematic religious persecution, creating a deadly mixture of political oppression and spiritual warfare against God's people. But here's the most frightening and significant aspect of this entire prophecy. These seemingly invincible iron nations won't ultimately fall and be destroyed because of external military forces attacking them from outside their borders. Instead, they will experience complete collapse because of internal division, conflict, and fragmentation that tears them apart from within their own borders and institutions. Daniel specifically says they are like iron mixed with ordinary potter's clay, which means they represent governments and societies that attempt to force together elements that simply cannot hold together permanently under pressure. Iron and clay have completely different properties and cannot be successfully mixed, no matter how much force is applied or how sophisticated the techniques used to combine them. The military superpowers of the last times will experience devastating internal fragmentation that will weaken their foundations until they face complete and total collapse from within. Nations that once seemed absolutely unbeatable and invincible will crumble into pieces because they tried to force together incompatible elements: brute military force with extreme moral tolerance, raw political power with spiritual decadence and moral relativism, iron-fisted authoritarian control with clay-like weakness in their moral and spiritual foundations. Modern political alliances, international military blocs, confederations of nations, and global organizations that depend solely on earthly power, human wisdom, and secular philosophy are ultimately destined for failure because they completely lack the moral and spiritual foundation that truly sustains lasting civilizations throughout history. The Book of Revelation presents some of the most detailed and specific prophecies found anywhere in Scripture about the coming destruction of nations that have elevated commercial success, material wealth, and economic power above all moral principles, spiritual values, and basic human dignity. The Apostle John, writing from his exile on the rocky island of Patmos, where he had been banished for preaching the gospel, received a remarkable and terrifying vision showing exactly how the great commercial powers of the last days would experience an economic collapse so sudden, severe, and complete that their own merchants, business leaders, and financial experts would weep in utter desperation and hopelessness. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore, John wrote in Revelation chapter 18, describing a scene of total economic devastation that would leave the world's most powerful trading nations in absolute ruin, and their populations in desperate poverty and confusion. But this prophetic economic crisis that John witnessed in his vision isn't just another ordinary recession, market downturn, or financial correction that might last for a few difficult years before recovery begins and prosperity returns. This is direct divine judgment falling from heaven upon nations that have made money, profit, material success, and economic growth their true God, effectively replacing worship of the Creator with worship of created things and elevating the pursuit of wealth above basic human dignity, moral responsibility, and spiritual truth. John describes with incredible precision and remarkable detail exactly what kinds of merchandise these doomed commercial nations traded in their relentless pursuit of ever greater profits and market dominance. Their massive cargo ships and trading vessels carried gold and silver from mines around the world, precious stones and pearls from the depths of the oceans, fine linen and purple cloth that only the wealthy could afford, silk and scarlet fabric that displayed luxury and status, all kinds of expensive scented wood from rare trees, all varieties of objects carved from ivory taken from elephants, countless items crafted from the most precious and valuable woods, bronze and iron shaped into tools and weapons, marble carved into statues and buildings. The ships also carried cinnamon and various exotic spices that enhanced food and provided medical benefits, fragrant oils and frankincense used in religious ceremonies and personal luxury, wine and olive oil that sustained both body and spirit, fine flour and wheat that fed the populations, cattle and sheep that provided meat and clothing, horses for transportation and warfare, and chariots that displayed power and military might. But then John mentions the most chilling, disturbing, and morally outrageous item of all in this extensive list of traded goods: bodies and souls of men. This shocking revelation shows that these commercial nations don't limit themselves to trading only material goods, natural resources, and manufactured products. They have systematically and deliberately reduced human beings themselves to mere merchandise, treating people as disposable commodities rather than as precious beings created in God's image with inherent dignity and eternal worth. This dehumanizing commerce includes extensive human trafficking networks that move people like cargo, brutal labor exploitation that treats workers as expendable machines, sexual slavery that destroys lives and families, organ harvesting that treats human bodies as spare parts, and every other form of commerce that degrades, destroys, and commodifies human dignity for the sake of profit and power. When God's righteous judgment finally comes upon these materialistic nations that have sold their souls for temporary wealth, they will watch helplessly as their entire commercial system collapses completely in just 1 hour. For in 1 hour your judgment has come, declares Revelation 18:10. In our modern era of instantaneous global communications, high-speed internet connections that span continents, and digital financial markets that operate around the clock across time zones, we can easily understand how this prophecy is not only possible, but inevitable. Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 contain one of the most terrifying, detailed, and specific prophecies found anywhere in biblical literature about the ultimate destiny of nations that will unite together in one final coordinated attack against Israel and God's people in the very last days of human history, before divine intervention ends human rebellion forever. A mysterious and powerful leader identified only as Gog, who is called the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal from the distant land of Magog, will successfully gather together a massive confederation of nations from around the entire world for one climactic, all-out assault against God's chosen people in their homeland. But this won't be merely another conventional military war between competing human armies fighting for territory, natural resources, political control, or economic advantage. This will be the decisive moment when God himself intervenes directly and supernaturally in human history to defend his people and demonstrate his absolute, unquestionable sovereignty over all nations, their rulers, their armies, and their destinies. And I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone, declares Ezekiel 38:22, describing supernatural judgment that goes far beyond anything that human military technology, advanced weapon systems, or nuclear arsenals could possibly produce or simulate. The nations that choose to participate in this final confederation against Israel will experience direct supernatural destruction from heaven itself that leaves no room for doubt about who truly controls the forces of nature and the destiny of every nation on earth. This won't be a conventional military defeat, where one army overcomes another through superior strategy, better weapons, larger numbers of soldiers, or more advanced technology. Instead, it will be God's own judgment, falling directly with fire from heaven, completely obliterating the attacking forces through divine intervention that demonstrates his power over every earthly government and military force that dares to oppose his will and attack his people. After every rebellious nation has fallen, after every proud human empire has been reduced to dust and ashes, after all earthly governments have been swept away by divine judgment like chaff before the wind, the prophet Daniel saw something absolutely glorious that fills every believer's heart with eternal hope, unshakable confidence, and perfect peace. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever, declares Daniel 2:44, with absolute certainty and divine authority. The supernatural stone that strikes the statue's feet and completely destroys all human governments doesn't simply bring destruction, chaos, and emptiness to leave the world in ruins. Instead, this divine stone grows into a great mountain that gradually fills the whole earth, covering every continent, reaching into every nation, and extending perfect rule to every corner of creation. This represents God's eternal kingdom that will replace every failed human system with perfect righteousness, absolute justice, complete peace, and unlimited prosperity for all who submit to divine authority and embrace God's perfect will for their lives. This divine kingdom possesses characteristics that no human government in all of history has ever achieved or even approached. It is completely eternal, meaning it will never end, never be replaced by something else, and never experience decline or decay. It is absolutely incorruptible, meaning no form of evil, injustice, deception, or wickedness can penetrate, influence, or corrupt its perfect administration. And it is totally indestructible, meaning no human force, demonic power, or rebellious coalition can weaken, damage, overthrow, or even threaten its eternal stability and perfect rule. While all human nations throughout history have experienced the endless cycle of rise and fall, growth and decline, strength and weakness, victory and defeat, this divine kingdom will only grow stronger, more glorious, and more perfect throughout all eternity until it covers the entire earth and extends its flawless rule to every corner of the universe. The book of Revelation shows us the ultimate culmination and final fulfillment of this glorious victory in the most beautiful, hope-filled, and comforting passage found anywhere in all of Scripture. Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. After all the destruction of rebellious nations has been completed, after every proud government has been humbled and permanently removed from power, after every form of human rebellion has been forever ended, God will establish his perfect kingdom, where there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. This is the ultimate destiny of all human history, not perpetual destruction, endless war, and continued suffering, but complete renewal, total restoration, and perfect peace under God's flawless government, where every tear will be wiped away, every injustice will be corrected, every broken heart will be healed, and every promise will be fulfilled forever. The choice that every nation faces today is absolutely clear, and carries eternal consequences that will determine their destiny forever. Nations can either align themselves with God's eternal kingdom and submit to his righteous authority, or they can persist in rebellion and face the same devastating judgment that has befallen every nation throughout history that chose to rise against the Most High and oppress his people. Nations that humble themselves and submit to God's eternal kingdom before the final judgment arrives will participate in the eternal glory, perfect peace, and unlimited blessing that awaits all who choose to serve the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But those nations that persist stubbornly in their rebellion against divine authority will experience exactly the destiny that these ancient prophecies have revealed with absolute precision and perfect accuracy.